What's up, guys? It's Bear Trap from AZ Fly Shop. We're here with Alex Loubere. He is one of our Arizona Game and Fish biologists. He is also a phenomenal fly tyer. He looks at fly tying a little bit differently than a lot of people do because of his profession, I'm guessing. He's been a big inspiration in my personal fly tying over the past couple years, since I've kind of been watching him tie and everything, and I get a lot for my own patterns from stuff that he's tied in the past and that has worked for him. He likes tying big bugs that push a lot of water. I'm gonna let him take it away from here. Take it away, Alex.
Thanks a bunch, man. Appreciate the kind words. So, one of the things that I specialize in is predator flies, and specifically tying with bucktail. In my opinion, bucktail is probably the single best material that you can use for tying bait fish patterns. There's a lot of really awesome synthetics on the market now, and don't get me wrong, I tie with those, but nothing can replace bucktail, in my opinion, for movement, for profile. So tonight I'm going to tie a bait fish pattern, just a single hooked, simple bulkhead, but we're going to do something a little cool with it. We're actually going to do the bulkhead in a dubbing loop. Bulkheads typically are kind of tough to tie because you have to get that flare just right and you have to comb it back and do multiple stacks consistently. Well, the dubbing loop takes a lot of that skill out of the equation. It's tricky to get the hair to stay in the loop sometimes, but once you get it spun up, it gives you a nice consistent flare, that perfect angle. So I'm going to show you how to sort of build this fly, and then we're going to take that bulkhead and we're going to hide it behind dubbing and eyes to give it a really realistic look. And the whole purpose of a bulkhead is to push water and make that fly swim really good. You get this nice hollow cylindrical profile that makes the fly walk side to side on the paws, and that, in my opinion, is what triggers predator strikes most often, is when you get that lateral movement, fly hangs in the water, shows its entire profile. That's oftentimes what triggers big predator fish, big pike, muskie, bass, to go in for the kills. When they make eye contact with that fly and they see the whole length of it, they can size it up as a meal. So without further ado, let's kind of get started here. I already got a hook on the vise and it's already lined up to save some time. The hook we're going to be using tonight is a Firehole 803P in size 4/0. So this is a pretty good sized hook. It's definitely not as big as I've tied on. I tie even bigger than that, but this is a nice, what we're going to build here is a nice like 5 to 7 inch long gizzard shad imitation, and this will be great for striped bass, largemouth, stuff like that. You could even throw this for pike. But to begin with, we're going to build our tail, which is going to be made out of this really neat material, this black fleck Flashaboo. This stuff, it has sort of black mixed in with the silver, and that kind of cuts down. It's not like super reflective, but it gives a nice like scale pattern to it. And I always like to start my tails by building a nice little hunk of that stuff off the back, and then that kind of length sets the entire profile of the fly. So I'm going to cut off, you know, a good little portion of that. We want to build our tail. We don't want our tail to be too thick, but we definitely want to have some substance back there so that the fly doesn't look kind of like front heavy when we're done with it. So I'm going to tie that in probably about 70-30. So 70% of this material is going behind the fly, and then about 30% is going to be up front. I'm just going to tie that in on the top of the hook here and give it a good couple winds back, just lash it down nice. And then I'm going to fold that 30% back over the top. And what that does is that kind of gives me the base and lets me gauge the proportions. So notice that this whole thing is about, I don't know, 3 times longer than the shank of the hook. So we'll trim that back if we need to, but if you tie it in too short, there's no way to make it longer. So it's better to tie it in long first and then shorten it if you need to. Now, to build some bulk off the tail, we're going to use some of this extra select craft fur. And this stuff is really neat. It's one of those synthetics I was talking about earlier that's a really good complement to bucktail because it flows really nice, it's really light, it sheds water quickly, but it doesn't like to flare like bucktail does, which is why it's not a true substitute. It's just sort of a supporting role here. But I'm going to take a nice hunk of this stuff, cut it off the patch I've got here, and then I'm going to look for my comb because I need that. Maybe I didn't bring it. Oh well. I can use my fingers here if you're a dummy like me and you forget your comb to just kind of pull that under fur out, because this stuff is junk. You don't want that in there. It's needless bulk. Makes life difficult when you go to tie the material in. So I've got this nice little hunk here of craft fur. I'm going to trim it off to kind of make the butts a little square so that it's a little easier to do this. And we're actually going to tie it with the tips facing towards the eye of the hook. I'm going to tie it in as close to full length as I can get it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take two kind of loose wraps here, and then I'm going to take my thumb and manipulate that stuff so it goes all the way around the hook shank. So I'm looking to get a nice even coverage of craft fur around the shank of the hook here right at the base, and I can turn my vise just to make sure that I've got good coverage. Looks like I do. So now I'm going to take my fingers and kind of splay that a little bit just so that I can easily get my tool in. And so now I've got this highly sophisticated tool, which is a pen that's had all the guts removed. People sell push tools that are sort of fancy, but I've found that my big pen works just as good as all that. So all I'm going to do is take this, and I'll use my fingers to kind of manipulate this because my goal is to have even dispersion of this fur around the hook shank. So I don't have any super thick patches or any super thin patches. So I kind of pull that back using the pen to kind of help me here, pulling out any loose fibers. I get this nice little reverse tied craft fur, and I'm just going to bullet tie that around. So now it's completely tied over itself. So you've got a nice little bullet tie here. I'm going to take my crazy glue, which is a brush-on crazy glue, which I always have. You can get at any hardware store. This stuff is super nice because it goes on thin. It dries really fast, so it doesn't take up a ton of time when you're trying to tie, waiting for glue to dry, which is like the worst thing ever, is when you're sitting there waiting for all your glue to dry up. So we'll give that a second, kind of make sure that it's tack free before we start messing around with the bucktail. So we've got our tail here now, which is just craft fur and Flashabou. Next, we're going to do our first stack of bucktails. So this first stack is going to be a straight tie. So what I mean by that is I'm going to tie it in with the tips facing back. After that, we're going to start going to our hollow ties or reverse ties. But this first stack is pretty easy. And I'm going to take it from the top portion of the tail. The reason I do this is because this top portion, these fibers up here are not as hollow as they are closer to the base of the tail. I don't want this rear part to flare very much. I want it to lay down because I'm trying to build a teardrop profile. As I move forward on the hook shank, I'm going to be starting to flare that bucktail more and more so that I get that nice fish-shaped profile that swims and really hangs and turns on the paws. So I'll pick some hair up here. I don't want to go too much, you know, like half a pencil width of bucktail here. And I'm just going to clip that off as close to the hide as I can get it. And just kind of flick that to clear out all the junk. So you don't even necessarily need a comb. You can just flick it, and it'll clean out all those little nasty under fibers and stuff that'll make it more difficult to manipulate the fiber when you get it on the hook shank. So now I'm going to measure this, and I'll make sure I don't tie it in too long, but I do want it to be fairly long so that I can keep that bulk in the rear, or at least the illusion of bulk. So again, we don't end up with a fly that's super front heavy. So that looks pretty good right about there. I'm going to tie this thing almost full length. And just like with the craft fur, I'm going to give it a few wraps. This time I'm going to do 3. Notice the material is now completely on the top of the hook shank. Maintaining tension on my bobbin, I'm going to manipulate that around the shank of the hook. That way I get good even coverage of that bucktail, so that I don't have any unbalance. This is worth taking your time and doing. Every stack of bucktail, making sure that you're as balanced as you can be, because with these flies, when you have a lot of material to one side or the other, it can affect the way the fly swims, and it's going to make it want to cut in the same direction every time, which isn't what you're looking for. So now that I've got this bucktail tied in and it looks like I'm pretty evenly distributed around the hook, just clear those fibers around the hook shank so that they lay the way they want to lay. I'm going to wrap forward just to trap all these butts in. Don't be shy with the thread here, especially if you're looking at throwing these at toothy critters. I am never ever shy about using thread wraps and glue to make sure that my fly is not going to fall apart after one fish. Spend sometimes north of 2 hours tying these flies. I don't really want them to break after I catch a single fish on them. So there's that first stack. That's our straight tie. Now I'm not going to tie in another stack until I'm kind of far up the hook, but I have this dead space here that I want to fill. And so I'm going to fill it with a dubbing loop of some shorter dubbing material that doesn't take up a ton of space, doesn't cause a ton of bulk, but it adds a little bit of flash underneath there, and it just makes the fly look a little bit nicer on the end. So I'm going to hook up my dubbing spinner here. And the stuff I'm going to use is good old-fashioned Arizona semi-seal. So locally sourced, good stuff. Some of my favorite dubbing to use for all kinds of flies, and I use it from everything from size 12 trout flies all the way up to 5/0, 6/0 musky flies. It has its place in there. I build it into composite loops with craft fur and stuff. It's great stuff because it's really thin and flashy, and it doesn't add a ton of bulk to the fly, but it adds some character to it. So when I'm building this, I want to rip stack this stuff to get these fibers kind of aligned. Notice how I'm kind of pulling it lightly apart and then stacking it back on top of itself. And what this does is it gets those dubbing fibers all lined up alongside each other, so you get this nice parallel look. You can kind of spread it out a little bit, and then I'm going to feed that in between my two threads of my dubbing loop here. And now I can continue to kind of spread it out inside this loop so that I get a nice separation of these fibers. Then I'm going to spin it up, make my brush. A good heavy dubbing spinner is useful for doing this because it kind of speeds the process up and kind of get things nice and trapped in there without having to spend a bunch of time spinning. That's nice and spun up. Now I'll take my little dubbing brush tool and just kind of brush that sucker out so that it gets all of those fibers that were kind of wrapped around the loop free, so you get your nice little brush here. Now I'm going to do a half hitch in my main thread so it doesn't come unwound when I start to spin this thing up. And I'm just going to use the rotary function on my vise to quickly get this dubbing loop onto the hook shank.
Somebody says that the instructor is incredibly attractive.
That's probably my wife. At least I hope it's my wife. It better be my wife.
No, it's actually a low water guy.
Oh, Derek. You dog. So you can see with a good rotary vise, you can spin that up nice and quick. Get your thread back down if it did something crazy while you were wrapping it, which it did this time. Tie this off. Now we can clip our dubbing loop off the hook shank. Give it some more thread wraps just to make sure it doesn't come loose on us. Now we can use our brush again to kind of get this semi-seal at its full length and nice and untangled from itself. So you get just this nice little poof of semi-seal that's going to ride underneath. This also helps support the bucktail. So when you're reverse tying, if it starts to collapse or something, it'll be kind of supported by that. When you get water tension on these flies as you're stripping them in, the bucktail will start to lay down a little bit, and this will just keep it sort of sitting at the right angle. So now I'm going to pick a little bit of bucktail that's further down the tail. So I want to get something that has a little bit more flair to it now because I'm closer, and I'm going to do my first reverse tie. So I'm going to choose a nice little healthy stack right here about midway down the tail. Probably not quite that much. Another common mistake people do when they're working with bucktail is trying to use too much at once. A little goes a long way, especially if you bolster it with some flash and stuff. You can really fill in the gaps and give the illusion of a lot of bulk without actually having a lot of bulk, which is nice because when you're trying to cast these flies all day, you don't want them to be actually bulky. You want them to look bulky without actually being bulky. And that's something that Bucktail is really good for. But it can also bite you in the rear if you end up using too much in your stack. So now this is where things get a little bit tricky because we want to make sure our proportions are correct. So I'm looking at the tips of my first stack of Bucktail, and I want the tips of this stack to kind of bleed into those tips, so when we get water tension on, they all just kind of blend together in one seamless teardrop shape. So I'm going to look at probably tying this in about like there, which means that when I flip this over and restack it with my fingers, I'm going to set it down on the hook shank about like right there. Now another nice little trick with this thread, this is 210 UTC by the way, is you can spin it up and really reduce the profile because you don't want a lot of surface area here. You want this to bite down on the bucktail and cause it to flare. So I'm going to give it 1 wrap, 2 wrap, 3 wraps, and then I'm going to tighten down on that a little bit. And again, I'm going to manipulate that with my fingers so that it goes all the way around the hook, and then I'm going to tighten down on it again. And I'm going to kind of peel at it as I do that. This is all designed to just help that bucktail flare. Because this is middle of the tail stuff, so it flares okay, but it definitely doesn't flare as good as, say, something right at the base. So we got to help it out a little bit. Now I'm going to check. I'm a little sparse on this far side, so I'm just going to manipulate some more over there, pull it tight. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to give it a couple more wraps just to make sure it stays put. And then I'm going to trim these butts out of here. So these butts are going to interfere with getting that bucktail at the right angle when I tie it back, so I'm going to trim them out. It also makes the finished fly look a little bit nicer, which I like my flies to look nice, as well as catch fish.
Oh, that's the point?
Yeah, catch fishermen, right? So now we've got this nice little poof of bucktail here. I'm going to take my fancy pen tool again, and I'm going to start to push. And as I push, I'm going to check my distribution. Did I get that evenly distributed around the hook? It looks like I did pretty good. But if you didn't, you can kind of use this opportunity here to pull things around and get them into the right spot. And then I'm going to push it all the way back. So this is another vibe check here for like your how well you did on your proportions. It looks like I did pretty good. So now I'm going to pinch that. I'm going to spin my thread again, and then I'm going to pull it straight along the hook shank and then up and around so that I get that thread like right in between the hairs and then around the hook, so I don't pull any hairs out of position when I go to pull that thread through in front. So I've got my thread in front now, and I'm kind of messing with this hair and just pulling it back. What you want to do is start to build a cone with this thread to kind of prevent this hair from going back the other way. And you can adjust your cone to how much angle and flare on that bucktail you want to get. This first stack I want to have lay back pretty good, so I'm going to tie a pretty good sized cone. And the cone can be tricky because you want that thing to be really uniform. So you got to watch your thread wraps here and make sure that your thread wraps are all nice and uniform as you're building this thing so that you don't end up with asymmetric flare. Because again, asymmetric flare means your swimming action is going to be affected. You're potentially going to have a fly that doesn't want to track correctly. So you have to make sure, I'm usually pretty deliberate. I don't use a ton of pressure here. Notice how I'm not reefing down on this thread when I go to make this cone, and then I'll build back down. So I'm trying to build a ramp here so that my thread doesn't want to slide off. So just gently add thread to that cone, and then you can let go and kind of check your angle. That's pretty good, but we need to lay it back just a little bit more. Another thing you can do if you have one handy is these little hair clips. You can pinch and hold, and that way you can kind of use both hands to check and tie up that cone. I'm doing pretty good here. I think this is just about good. Notice here now I'm like sub 45 degree angle. And everything looks pretty dang even here. Just check the front. Don't be afraid to kind of look down the front of it. And you can kind of, at this stage, you can kind of pull the bucktail a little bit, and that will move the cone slightly so that you get more flare where you need to. That looks pretty dang good. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to glue it now so it doesn't go anywhere. Again, crazy glue is your best friend when you're building predator flies because it makes sure that things don't move. And
now, can you use any CA plus?
Glue?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just like the brush on crazy glue because it dries really fast.
Yeah. But Zap a Gap or things like that will work perfect.
Yep. All the fly tying specific glues will work just fine. That's just my personal glue of choice is the crazy glue brush on. So while that glue is still drying, we can take the opportunity to set another dubbing loop, and then it wants to stay really nice. So with this, as I'm building this dubbing loop now, I want to try to build a little bit of thread mass so that we don't have too steep of an angle, because then when I try to wind that, it's going to want to slide down, and it's so annoying. So we're going to take our thread and kind of build up a little bit of bulk here so that our next loop of semi-seal will wind on nice and even. I take my dubbing spinner and hook it in again. Take my dubbing wax, which is Orvis, don't tell Chris Rich. It's non-sanctioned tying materials.
Non-sanctioned tying materials.
Semi-seal again. And again, we're going to rip stack it so that it gets nice and parallel. So we get a nice clean dubbing loop when we go to spin this thing up. Feed that in there, kind of spread it around. Looks pretty good, so I'm going to give her a spin. And this really isn't necessary. If you don't want to add the semi-seal, you can just do stacks of bucktail. I just like it because it gets a little bit of underflash. Whenever I'm building these flies, I think about in layers of complexity, because the real deal, I mean, if you ever hold a fish and really look at it, it's like there's so many layers to what's going on there with the appearance, right? There's scales, but there's skin under scales that might be slightly different color. You just get, it's very much a 3D experience, so that's what we're trying to build right here, is we're trying to build some sort of complexity, or at least the illusion of complexity underneath our bucktail, so that when, you know, it's tough conditions, we're trying to coax a bite, or water's super clear, fish are spooky, that when they get close and inspect this thing, that it doesn't fail that up close inspection. I'd say probably 90% of the time you can catch fish on just bucktail lash to a hook, but we want to tie flies for that 10% of the time as well when things are tough and we have to really convince fish that what we're trying to offer them is real food. So again, we'll spin this thing up just to kind of coat that ramp, give us a little bit of flash underneath. So tie this back. Add a snip. So now we're ready for another reverse tie. This one we're going to do a little bit higher angle because we're starting to get close to the head here. This is actually going to be the last reverse tie we do before we go for glory and go for the dubbing loop. And then after the dubbing loop, we'll stack our dubbing and eyes and we'll hopefully be done. But we've got pretty good. I'm definitely going to trim some of that off so that it's off the tips once we're done here, but I'll probably wait until the fly's a little closer to being done before I trim anything, because I'm a little superstitious about trimming before the fly's done, because I've multiple times trimmed a fly too early and then discovered that I would have preferred to have left it long. So we're going to go pretty close now down to the base, and I'm looking for some fibers that are pretty hollow. Kind of pick through your tail. Actually, this side looks like there's a little bit better hollow fibers. So I'm going to pick a chunk here. Looks good. Again, snip it off as close to the hide as I can get. Pulling out all of that nasty stuff. Look at all that. We don't want any of that in our fly. Not only is it going to make it harder to flare the hair, this stuff can actually cut your thread. Since I'm not using GSP, and the reason I'm not using GSP is awesome. It's like impossible to snap. I've snapped it a few times reefing on flies, but it's really slippery, so you don't have a lot of control over your materials, unfortunately, with GSP, which is why I like to use just standard thread and 210 denier when I'm doing a lot of this bucktail stuff. So now, again, we're going to kind of measure. So notice tips here, I actually want to move a little bit further up. So I'm going to trim this back a little bit, set it down on top, spin my thread so that I can maximize my flaring capabilities. Give it 3 nice loose wraps, cinch down. Keep working this thing around the hook so that I get nice even distribution, just like the last one. Kind of pull on those fibers. There they go. Now they're starting to flare pretty good there. Okay, check our distribution. Distribution looks pretty even around that. I'm going to trim my butts. Alright, now the pen comes in. Check our distribution again. Spread those fibers out if we need to, so that we're folding them straight back on themselves. Now, so for this one, I'm kind of want to get an angle about like that. That would be the optimal angle. So I'm going to try to make that happen. We'll see how it goes. I've done a lot of work with bucktail, and sometimes it just doesn't want to behave, but it seems to be doing okay tonight. So again, I'm going to wind my thread and start to build my cone, making sure that I keep my thread wraps nice and even, straight up and down, straight side to side, so that I get a nice symmetrical cone, and my hair is going to flare or lay back in a symmetrical fashion, so we get that nice swimming action. If we've done everything correctly by the end when we go out to swim this fly, it should walk the dog underwater, which is exactly the action that we're looking for. We're looking for that nice side-to-side walk. What we don't want is a fly that wants to turn only left or only right. That doesn't look so great. So by building this thing symmetrical, we ensure that it wants to walk just how we want it. So,
and you tie all your streamers on a loop knot to help that, don't you?
Yes, everything I do is on a Cray. It's called a Cray Loop. I think is developed by Lefty Cray, and it's a nice little clean knot that lets that fly have total free reign of its head when it's underwater. So when you give it slack, it'll just kick one way or kick the other. And I've had my best success on flies that have that lateral motion. It doesn't matter if we're talking about bass, pike, muskie, big trout, you name it. If it eats other fish, it seems like getting that side-to-side motion and that slow fall is what triggers the eat most of the time. So we'll try to replicate that, because if you see, I mean, if you're talking about wounded fish, that's pretty much a no-brainer, right? That they will dart side to side. But even healthy fish, when they're looking to run away from a predator that's chasing them, they take evasive motion that usually is in a zigzag form. They're darting this way, that way. And so we're trying to replicate that movement, because that seems to be a real big trigger for predators. So you've got our bucktail laid back, and I'm just kind of pulling on this to kind of get it to sit up a little bit more, because it actually started to lay down more than I wanted it to lay down. And so now I feel pretty good about trimming my tail. So I'm going to take my flash tail and see, here's the tips of my first stack of bucktail. I'm going to go maybe 1/8 of an inch beyond that and just sort of start to slowly feather with the scissors to clip that, so that ideally when this thing gets wet, it's going to slick down and get to a nice point. Get that beautiful hydrodynamic teardrop shape that we want. So we're going to bust the Flashabou out again though, because I want to give this thing some lateral flash so that it sort of mimics a lateral line or something like that. So I'm going to take another little hunk of fiber here, a little bit less than what we used for the tail, you know, like maybe 10 strands or something like that. We're going to cut that off the main hunk without hopefully cutting too many that we didn't grab. So we've got this. We're going to take our fingers and kind of split it in half, so that we got one half in one hand and the other half in the other hand. Each one of these is going to be lateral line now. So I set that first one without talking because I had the second one in my mouth, but as I do the second one, I'll explain what it is that I'm actually doing. So to set this, I'm going to take it and I'm going to pinch it about 60% one side, 40% the other around the thread. And I'm going to pinch it like this, and I'm going to take my thread and I'm going to set it down on the side of the shank, and then I'm going to give it a couple of wraps around and just start to walk it up the side of the hook shank, so that we get two nice little stripes here running down the side of the fly. And they're a little long, so I'm going to trim them back just a hair so that they're kind of even with the tips of our first reverse tie of the bucktail. That seems to be, in my eyes anyway, what produces the sort of most consistent blend of the lateral flash into the tail flash when this fly is actually swimming. So now we got that. We're ready for our dubbing loop, which is arguably the trickiest part of this whole operation. So I'm going to set a dubbing loop that's decently long because I'm going to want to get some leverage on this thing when I go to spin it up. And instead of just winding forward now, I'm actually going to pinch this thing. So I'm going to take my bobbin and I'm going to wrap it around it, cinch it up, and then I'm going to walk it down to the eye. And what that does is it makes this thing want to stay really closed because we're going to try to maximize friction here, because the first thing this bucktail is going to want to do when you set it in the loop is it's going to want to slide. And we don't want that. We want it to stay exactly where I put it so that we can spin it up and get that thing to flare. So I just half hitched my thread and I'm going to set it on the bobbin cradle there. And now I'm actually going to go to a couple of different tails. So I've got some bucktails here that I've mangled pretty good, but they still have some hair down here at the base. And this stuff, for a loop like this, you want to look for bucktail that's really, really hollow, like almost belly hair hollow, because we're going to spin it up and we want that thread to bite in and crush that bucktail down so that it flares and it gets stuck in the dubbing loop and stays put. If you try to do stuff out of the back of the tail here, it's just going to slip around on you and you're going to be annoyed and it's not going to work. So you want to get this stuff here, and you can see like how hollow that is. It's super thick, super hollow. That's going to be really easy to spin up comparatively. So I'm going to give a little bit of a hot spot to this fly by using a little bit of chartreuse along with the white. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take some white from this tail and I'm going to trim it again as close to the hide as I can get, so I can kind of maximize that length. Get a nice little chunk there. And I'm going to set that in my deer hair stacker just for now, because I'm now going to go to this tail and I'm going to pick a nice little hunk of this chartreuse. I'm going to cut that off right at the hide, just like the last one. Get all that under fur junk out from underneath it so that we don't have any little wispies interfering with our dubbing loop spin up here. Then I'm going to take my white and my chartreuse. I'm going to stack them on top of each other like this and kind of pinch them with my hand so we get this nice little flared up doopy here. I'm going to take my dubbing wax and I'm going to go to town on this. Like really, like way more dubbing wax than you think you need. This isn't a little nymph or something we're trying to spin up. We're trying to make sure that we get as much friction as we can to make this bucktail stay where it's supposed to. So now I'm opening this with my fingers. I'm going to shove that in there, leaving the butts kind of long because that's going to be our bulkhead once this thing's all spun up. And then I'm just going to work this bucktail down the loop. Just being careful not to let it slip. And we want to get it kind of sparse here because if there's any thick spots, it's those spots aren't going to want to spin. So we got to get it nice and sparse here, and I'll try to lower it so you can kind of see. But it's sparse, and these bucktail fibers are nice and perpendicular to the loop. So now I'm going to spin, but I'm going to hold tight so that it doesn't spin up right away because I'm going to create a lot of tension on that. I want a lot of torque before I start to spin it. So here, boom. That was pretty good. I'm going to shift this down a little bit if I can. And really notice how hard I'm reefing on this because I'm trying to get that bucktail to flare and that thread to bite in so that it wants to stay put. And I'm just going to keep reefing and keep reefing until I feel like my thread is going to break, because that way I know that that bucktail is stuck. That looks pretty dang good. I'm going to use my little bodkin here brush. So now I've got this crazy mess, right? Now I've got to get this on the hook shank, and I'm going to use the rotary tool to accomplish this. I'm just going to wind it up, and I'm going to use my fingers to kind of tame it back as I wind. So I'll do like a quarter turn at a time, tame my tail back, another quarter turn or so, making sure that my wraps are pretty close to touching. Try not to impale yourself on the hook like I just did. If you ain't bleeding, you're not tying streamers, but try to limit the amount of damage to one's fingers while doing this. We'll walk this thing down that hook shank and cover that distance until we get almost to the eye. So once I get this close, I actually like to kind of manually wind because it gives me a little bit more control. Once I can kind of clear this bobbin cradle, I'll start to kind of manually wind it. And yeah, the bobbin likes to do that because Renzetti didn't think about super big flies when they made that bobbin cradle. It needs an XL one. So now, just about there, got this hot mess going on. It'll turn out nice, I promise. I'm going to tie this thing off. I'm not too worried about accidentally tying over the top of some of these butts. I'll just tie them back after I get this spinner off, clipped off here. Cool. That went really well. Sometimes the bucktail dubbing loops don't go so hot, but that one turned out quite nice. So you got this nice set of butts here that are creating what's going to create a ton of water push when this fly is stripped through the water. There's a ton of buoyancy in this, so you get a lot of like hang time on the paws, which I also love on these predator flies. But to finish it off, notice we've got kind of a lot of room here. I'm actually going to build a stacked dubbing and eyes head over the top of this bucktail bulkhead, this dubbing loop bulkhead, which will effectively kind of hide it. It'll increase the durability of that bulkhead, and it'll also add a lot of realism, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. Because I love stacked dubbing heads, but especially if you're pike or muskie fishing, you throw a leader, titanium leader on the front of that, the thing will nosedive. Bulkheads will hang even with titanium, but you don't get that realism of the eyes and the durability of the the glue that you get with those stack dubbing heads. So finish this thing off. I'm going to use 2 different colors of Bruiser Blend. This one's Alpha Wolf and this is Unicorn Mane. Goofy names, but this stuff makes a really cool sort of blend of sort of a dark back like you see on typical minnows with a nice creamy flashy little belly. So with this stuff I like to kind of just get a little corner coming out of the top, and then I just kind of pull with my fingers, and I want to get a pretty decent little stack, probably like a pencil's width if it's just sitting there. And just like the semi-seal, I'm kind of pulling on this stuff to get those fibers to line up, and look at how long that gets when you pull it. You get those fibers to line up, you get a nice little tuft of dubbing, which is going to go on the front here. So that looks like about enough. Maybe I'll take just a hair more to make sure that we get a good even coverage on the front of this thing. Pull and stack. That looks good. I'm going to set that down, and I'm going to go for my unicorn's mane, which is going to be my belly, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to get a little corner to come out here, and I'm just going to kind of yank at it just to pull things. That kind of helps already sort of pre-align the fibers, and then it'll make my job of rip stacking and getting everything set in a parallel fashion, and then kind of compare the two to see if those 2 stacks are of equal densities, because again, just like everything else with this fly, we want to make sure that it's symmetrical. So that looks a little heavy, so I'm going to take just a little bit off of that to make sure that those 2 are even. That looks pretty good. So now I'm going to tie these in probably about 60-40 again, because I want a little bit more going back than in front. I'm just going to set that stack of dubbing right on top of the hook. I'm going to give it a loose wrap there, and then 2 more kind of tight ones. And then I'm going to kind of use my fingers to pull on this and get it kind of flattened and distributed across the top of the hook, across the top of that dubbing loop there. And I kind of check again. I can spin around, make sure that I'm kind of in the right plane, and I've got everything kind of 50-50 there. It's sitting right on top of the hook, kind of flared out. Now I'm going to do the same thing with my bottom stack. I'm going to set, kind of line those 2 things up there with the top dubbing stack, give myself a loose wrap, and then 2 more tight ones. And then typically you need to pull it back towards you, because when you wind, it wants to go around the other side of the hook and run from you, so you kind of got to pull it back a little bit. But setting it, as long as you gave yourself enough room and didn't crowd the eye, it shouldn't be too hard to move this stuff around. So I can kind of pull it and flare it, get it to where I'm happy with it. It looks pretty good. So now I'm going to take my fingers and just kind of pull that back. I'm going to lift the thread to where it's off the side here and out of the way. Pull that back, and then I'm going to take it straight through and around the eye. And one of the things I love about these firehole predator hooks is they made really big honking eyes on it, so I can really build a thread dam here and cram a bunch of thread in front to kind of tie stuff off. Appreciate that. That was a nice design feature. So there's my head. Nice little stack dubbing head. We're going to do some eyes on it, but first I have to whip finish the fly. Let me find my whip finishing tool that I finally learned how to use after tying for like 6 years. I'm using my fingers like a Neanderthal. Alright, so we've got our dubbing head here. Now we just need to put some reflective eyes. I think these are 8mm? I can't remember. Kind of use your judgment and figure out what eyes look sort of proportional to the fly. I like to err on the side of using smaller eyes if I can, because again, with eyes comes weight, and weight at the head of the fly kills the action. So we want to kind of limit how much weight we're throwing right up front here, especially if we're going to then be adding a leader on top of that if we're going for toothy critters. So next up is the Loctite Gel Control This stuff is what I use to set my eyes, because when it sets rock solid, and it's very hard for things to rip them off. So I'm going to take this little applicator and just dab a little bit of, you don't want to go too hard on this, because then it's going to squirt out the sides. You're going to glue your fingers to your fly, which is, nobody wants that. So nice little generous dollop, but not too generous. I don't really know how to quantify that, so you're just going to have to interpret that how you will. So we're going to set it on the side of the fly, kind of push it into place. I like to turn my fly sideways, make sure that I've got it kind of flat and even, and then we're going to go to the other side and we're going to repeat the process. I'm going to take a nice little dollop here. I'm going to try to line it up as evenly as I possibly can with that other eye. Get that set. That's pretty good for a first attempt. I'm going to pinch them just to kind of help that glue grab a hold of the fibers, soak in. I'm going to check to make sure that they're sort of even with each other. I'll nudge that one back just a hair. And that's the essence of the fly. We're still got to do a little bit of UV resin to get those eyes fully set, but while we're waiting for that to cure, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about bucktail and what makes it so special. Bucktail is naturally tapering because it is hair. Things like craft fur do not taper naturally, so in order to achieve the illusion of taper, when they build this stuff onto the fiber, they have different lengths of fibers. So when you comb out those lengths, you end up with just a very homogeneous fiber. So bucktail actually starts thick and gets thinner on its own, and when you put water tension on that, it just flows like nothing else. It also is super durable for a hair. Like, you can obviously rip it, and pike and muskie will certainly destroy a fly after a while, but as far as durability for natural materials go, bucktail is pretty much unmatched. And of course, it has that nice function where it'll flare. So this thing looks a little cattywampus right now, but what I like to do when I'm done with these flies is I'll get them wet until the bucktail all lays down completely, and then I'll hang them just by the hook. Like, I'll attach a paper clip and just hang them, let them dry, air dry, and then that thing will be sitting kind of how it'll sit when you get it wet and you start fishing it. So whenever I take photos and stuff, I let those flies hang. I'll get them wet, let them hang, so that they adopt the profile that they're going to adopt when they get wet. What did I do with my comb? Must not have brought it. Just imagine that memory of bringing it and throwing it in. That's all right. I'll figure it out. We'll set this loop with without combing it out, unless you have a beard comb or something handy. You just shaved though, so now we're gonna do our UV resin, and in order to do that, I like to change the angle. This is another nice little trick that I figured out to help make it a little bit easier to get the right angle on that UV resin. So I actually tilt that fly nose down and then turn my vise upside down. That way, when I apply that UV resin, it sinks back into the fly instead of getting in the hook eye and gooping everything up. So I'm going to take this applicator and I'm just going to dollop some of this loon thin resin in here. I like the thin because it likes to soak into the fibers a little bit better than the thick, but it's not totally runny like the flow is, and that gives me a little bit of time to kind of adjust the angle of these fibers before I set them. I hit it with the torch just for a few seconds to get that hard, and then I'm going to put another dollop on top to kind of start to build the shape of the front of the head here and get that nice and smooth so that there's no area for a tooth to catch or anything like that. Again, hit it with the light, cure it up. So that sets these fibers at the right angle so that we get a nice fishy looking head. So now that bottom's done, I'm going to flip it around and relock it for the same reason as we did with the bottom, just to make sure that we get that UV resin so that it sets back into the fibers and doesn't get into the hook eye on us and kind of gum up the works there. So I'm going to walk that back again, like halfway back to the eye. I don't like to set a ton of UV resin on the head if I can get away with it, because again, it adds a ton of weight, and the last thing I want to do is put a bunch more weight than is necessary on the front of this fly. So we'll hold that in position, the right angle, and get that set. Check the tack there, looks good. So we'll add more. Get that nice little clean glossy bubble there, set it. Give that a few seconds. And that fly is done. So this is a pretty straightforward tie. This thing will lay back and get really nice and teardrop shaped once it gets wet and you start stripping it. But this bucktail fly will catch everything from largemouth to pike to muskie to striped bass. It walks the dog really nice underwater, so when you hit that pause, it'll just turn this way. You strip it again, it'll turn that way, as long as I built the materials, you know, evenly. And it's been one of my favorite patterns to fish in various configurations. I'll tie these on the Ahrex weedless hooks and stuff too. But the bucktail dubbing loop has really made building symmetrical bulkheads that are nice and tapered a lot easier. So I wanted to share that with you all tonight, and hopefully, even if you're not at a level with bucktail where you feel like you can replicate this fly, that you took something out of this video that you can use to kind of help. Maybe you haven't started working with bucktail before, you can start dipping your toes into that rabbit hole and see if you can start tying up some baitfish patterns, because in my opinion, there's no better material on planet Earth for tying baitfish flies than bucktail. But thank you.
Awesome.